Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a world today that I find, well, pretty fascinating. Opus Dei. It's one of those things, you hear the name, but do you really know what it is? And thanks to you listeners sending in all this material, I think we can take a pretty good crack at it. We've got academic definitions of those always tricky terms, sects and cults, which is helpful. But the real gem here is Maria del Carmen Tapia's book, Beyond the Threshold, A Life in Opus Dei.
Oh, absolutely. That book was, well, a real eye-opener, to put it mildly.
Right. So where do we even begin with something like this? I mean, first we have to lay some groundwork. What is Opus Dei? Then we can jump into who this Maria del Carmen Tapia was and what her experiences were, what she's telling us. And that leads to the big question, right? The one everyone seems to have. Is this a sect? A cult? Are those labels accurate? I guess that's what we're here to find out.
Well, to start unpacking all that, let's just get some basics out there. Opus Dei, formally, it's the prelature of the Holy Cross in Opus Dei, but nobody really calls it that. It was founded in 1928 by Josemaría Escrivá.
Escrivá. Okay, now, was he...
Spanish priest, very influential in Opus Dei's early days, and he was later made a saint by the Catholic Church. Canonized, I mean.
So right off the bat, there's this strong tie to, traditional Catholicism. But I'm guessing Opus Dei puts its own spin on things.
Yeah, you could say that. One of their core beliefs is that everyone is called to be holy. It's not just for, priests or nuns or whatever. They really stressed finding God in the everyday stuff, your job, your routine, all that mundane stuff. It's like an opportunity to grow spiritually, they say.
Huh. That's kind of cool, actually. It's not about, running off to a monastery to be holy. It's about living in the world.
Exactly. And that idea really resonated with people. Opus Dei has centers all over, in more than 60 countries. They've got members from all sorts of backgrounds, professionals, regular folks, you name it.
So not some tiny, isolated group, then?
Nope, not at all. And because they're so widespread, that's part of what makes Maria del Carmen Tapia's story so powerful.
Okay, let's talk about it. I mean, she wasn't just some casual observer, was she?
Not even close. She was a numerary for 20 years. That's a celibate member, not a priest. But they live and work within Opus Dei, dedicated, their whole lives.
Wow. And Tapia, she actually worked for Escrivá, right?
As his secretary, yeah. So she was right there in the inner circle.
And then she leaves. And she writes this book, Beyond the Threshold. And I'm getting the feeling that book caused some problems.
It kind of blew things wide open. I mean, she's giving you this insider view of what was going on in Opus Dei. And some of it... Well, it raised a lot of questions, let's just say.
What kinds of questions? Give us an example.
Well, one of the big things Tapia talks about is the strict hierarchy within Opus Dei. You had to obey your superiors, no questions asked. You couldn't disagree, couldn't criticize. And she even described members reporting on each other, like spying almost.
Yikes, that sounds intense. Like a really controlled environment.
It was. Tapia felt like she was always being watched, judged. And she said that whole system, it squashed any kind of independent thinking. It made people afraid.
That reminds me of those definitions we talked about, the ones for cults and sects, that whole thing about suppressing dissent, controlling information.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about what you said or thought either. Tapia described some intense spiritual practices, too.
Oh, right. You mentioned something about what was a corporal mortification. I have to admit, I'm not totally clear on what that means.
Basically, it involves things like self-flagellation, or they'd wear these instruments. One's called a cilice. It's like a spiked chain worn around the thigh. They believe that by causing themselves physical pain, they're offering it up to God and being disciplined.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I know some religions have fasting and stuff, but this seems pretty extreme.
It is. And Tapia, she doesn't hold back in her descriptions. You really get a sense of the toll it took on her physically and mentally.
And the key here is she actually lived through it. This isn't just someone looking in from the outside and guessing.
Nope. And that's a big part of why Beyond the Threshold was so controversial.
I bet Opus Dei was thrilled about that book, huh?
Let's just say they weren't happy. They tried everything to discredit Tapia to stop people from reading it, called her a liar, said she was twisting the truth, even tried to block the book from being sold.
Makes you wonder, if there's nothing to hide, why go through all that trouble?
Right. A lot of people were asking that same question. All that backlash, it just made people more suspicious of Opus Dei. And it really fueled the debate about whether what they were doing was even real Catholicism.
So you have Opus Dei saying they're all about holiness and living a devout life. But then you have Tapia's story, and it sounds a lot more controlling, maybe even manipulative.
Yeah, and that's the tension we have to sort through here. We need to look closely at what Tapia described, what the effects of those practices might be, and how all that lines up with those broader definitions of cults and sects we have.
It seems like control is kind of the common thread here in Tapia's story. But I want to dig into some specifics. She mentioned that Opus Dei, they had a lot of control over their members' personal lives, right?
Yeah, totally. She talks about how they limited contact with family and friends, like even who you could be friends with. And forget about hobbies or interests outside Opus Dei. They basically wanted you to give your whole life to the organization.
So they kind of isolate you, make you dependent on the group.
That's exactly what Tapia is saying. She says it creates this us versus them mentality. The outside world, it's like dangerous and bad, you know?
Oh man, that totally fits with those cult warning signs we were looking at, the ones about creating a closed system, making everyone outside the group the enemy.
Yep, spot on. Control the information, control the people.
Tapia also mentioned something about Opus Dei and money, like how they handle their finances. I think she said there wasn't much transparency, and they expected members to give a lot.
Right, that's something a lot of people have questioned. Especially because Opus Dei, they're not exactly hurting for money, but how they get it, how they spend it, it's all a bit hush-hush.
And remember, these concerns are coming from someone who was in Opus Dei for 20 years. And not just a regular member, she was in leadership. She's not making this stuff up.
Exactly. That's why Beyond the Threshold had such a huge impact. It totally shattered the image Opus Dei had built up. It pulled back the curtain and showed people what was really going on, and a lot of people found it really disturbing.
It's important to remember that she's not the only one who said these things either. There are others who've left Opus Dei and told similar stories, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And when you put all those stories together, it really paints a picture of an organization that maybe they care more about control and everyone following the rules than they do about their members' well-being or even their spiritual freedom.
Which brings us back to that big question, right? The whole, is Opus Dei a sect or a cult thing?
It's tough. It's not a simple yes or no answer. I mean, Opus Dei, they deny it completely, obviously. They say they're recognized by the Catholic Church. They're just trying to help people live holy lives. Nothing weird going on here, right?
But then you have people like Tapia saying, yeah, that's what they say, but the reality is different. That all this stuff about holiness is just a cover for manipulation and control and silencing anyone who disagrees.
Right. And when you look at the actual practices, the stuff Tapia described, the hierarchy, the control, the isolation, the pressure to give money, it's not hard to see why people might think, okay, this is starting to look kind of culty.
So what are regular people supposed to do? I mean, there's so much information out there. Who do you believe?
It's all about being like a critical thinker. You got to look at all sides of the story, weigh the evidence, and honestly, a little healthy skepticism never hurts.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that groups like Opus Dei, they present themselves a certain way, and that way may not match up with what's actually happening behind closed doors.
Exactly. And that's why stories like Tapia's are so important. It gives you a completely different perspective.
Tapia's story definitely got people talking about Opus Dei, that's for sure. And those conversations are still going on. It really makes you think about power and control and where the line is between being devoted to something and being, well, taken advantage of.
And it's not just about Opus Dei either. It's a bigger conversation about what happens when groups have too much power over their members, in any context.
This deep dive has been, well, intense, to say the least. What stood out to you as we've been going through all this?
I think the most interesting thing for me has been how Tapia's story makes you really grapple with the idea of faith and authority. Like, when does devotion become unhealthy? When does someone cross the line from being a leader to being controlling? It's something to really think about, and it applies to way more than just Opus Dei.
Man, that's deep. And so true. If anyone out there is feeling like hooked by this deep dive, don't stop here. Read more about Opus Dei. See what their supporters say. See what their critics say. Look at what other Catholic groups do.
The more you know, the better you can decide for yourself.
This has been another wild ride, folks. Thanks for joining us as we dug into the world of Opus Dei. Until next time, keep those brains working. It's weird, right? Throughout this whole deep dive, I keep going back and forth. On the one hand, you've got this organization. It's part of the Catholic Church. They say they're about traditional values, and they seem to have all these devoted followers. But then you hear these stories like Tapia's, and it's all about control and people being manipulated. How do you even make sense of that?
It just shows you how complicated this stuff is. Faith, authority, all that. It's not always clear-cut, you know what I mean? Especially with something like religion, where people's beliefs are so strong.
Yeah, it's easy to get stuck in that black and white thinking. But even with those definitions, the ones for cults and sects, it's not like a checklist you can just tick off, right? It depends on the situation.
100%. What might seem suspicious in one context might be totally normal in another. It's about looking for patterns of behavior, not just one thing here or there. You gotta use your brain, be critical.
Well, we've definitely had a lot to think about Opus Dei specifically, but also just the whole idea of authority and belief systems and how they work.
What's been the biggest takeaway for you?
Honestly, the power of those personal stories, like Tapia's, the way she describes everything so vividly with all the details, it's hard to ignore that. She lived it, 20 years of her life.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the official story, the one the group wants you to believe, it doesn't always match up with what people are actually experiencing, and it's important to listen to those people, the ones who speak out, even if what they're saying is hard to hear.
It took guts for her to write that book, to tell her story, knowing how much backlash she'd get. That's brave. She could have just stayed quiet, but she chose to speak up. That says a lot, I think.
For sure. And it also shows that we all have a responsibility to think critically about the information we're getting, especially when it comes to groups like Opus Dei, organizations that can have a lot of influence over people.
So back to our original question, is Opus Dei a sect, a cult? Did we find the answer?
I don't think the point was to give a definitive answer. It's more about giving you the tools, the information, so you can decide for yourself. We've looked at both sides, the arguments, the evidence. It's complicated, but now you've got something to work with.
And if anyone's interested in digging deeper, please do. There's so much out there about Opus Dei. Read what their supporters say. Read what their critics say. Compare them to other Catholic groups.
Keep learning, keep asking questions.
This has been quite a journey, folks. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Opus Dei. See you next time. And until then, keep exploring.